In the long, dark history of American slavery, countless names have faded into silence, but some stories, though buried, refuse to die. One of those belongs to Wallace Turnage, a boy born into bondage who would spend his life fighting for a freedom most believed he would never see. Torn from his family before he could understand the meaning of the word slave, sold and resold like a piece of property, beaten into submission, and hunted like an animal after daring to escape, Wallace's life was one of unimaginable suffering and unshakable resilience. His courage was not forged in comfort but in the cruelest conditions imaginable. And yet, through relentless will, he defied every chain that sought to hold him. This is the forgotten story of a man who refused to break, and whose fight for freedom exposes the brutal heart of America's greatest sin. Wallace Turnage was born into bondage in the mid-1840s in North Carolina, a region where slavery was not just an institution but a foundation upon which wealth, power, and identity were built. From the moment he drew his first breath, his life was determined by laws and customs that declared him property. His mother, an enslaved woman, was herself a victim of this system, and his father, a white man, never acknowledged him. Like thousands of children born into slavery, Wallace's life began with a contradiction. He was both a human being and, under the law, a commodity. Childhood under slavery was rarely childhood at all. From a young age, Wallace was forced into labor, performing tasks far beyond his years. Enslaved children were often made to fetch water, care for livestock, sweep floors, or tend fires. Work meant to prepare them for a lifetime of servitude. Yet this was more than physical labor. It was a deliberate system designed to break the will before it could form. The idea was simple. If a person was made to believe from birth that they were meant to serve, they would never question the system that enslaved them. Wallace, however, was not easily broken. Despite his circumstances, there was something within him, a flicker of defiance that would not die. As he grew, so did his awareness of the injustice around him. He watched as families were torn apart on auction blocks, mothers separated from children, husbands from wives. He listened to the whispers of those who spoke of freedom, a word that meant nothing tangible to him yet filled his imagination with endless possibility. Even as a boy, Wallace sensed that his fate was not sealed, that life could be more than chains and commands. The 1850s were a decade of intense transformation and growing tension in the United States. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it easier for enslavers to hunt down runaways even in free states, and the Underground Railroad was becoming more organized and daring. For enslaved people like Wallace, the risks of escape grew higher, but so did the dream of liberation. Every story of a successful runaway, whether true or exaggerated, spread like wildfire among the enslaved population, planting seeds of hope that no amount of cruelty could uproot. Wallace's life took a darker turn as he was sold to new masters, a common fate for enslaved children. Each sale was another rupture, severing ties and removing what little stability he might have known. The slave markets of the South were brutal theaters of human misery. Bodies were prodded, teeth examined, and prices haggled over as if people were livestock. Wallace endured this dehumanizing spectacle more than once. With each sale, his hatred of bondage deepened. One of the defining features of Wallace's early life was punishment. The enslaved lived under constant threat of violence, for disobedience, for mistakes, or sometimes for nothing at all. Beatings, lashings, and public humiliations were used as tools of control. Wallace felt the lash many times, but rather than crushing his spirit, these punishments hardened his resolve. They taught him a grim truth, that there was nothing he could endure in pursuit of freedom that was worse than the life he was living. By his teenage years, Wallace began attempting the unthinkable: escape. Each attempt was a lesson, each failure a chapter in his education. His first effort was spontaneous and poorly planned. He slipped away under cover of darkness, guided only by instinct. But he was unfamiliar with the terrain, and within days he was captured and dragged back. The punishment was brutal as it was meant to be. Yet even as he lay bruised and bleeding, Wallace knew he would try again. Subsequent attempts were more calculated. He learned from observation, watching the movements of patrols, studying the geography of the land, and listening to the whispered advice of those who had tried before him. He discovered the importance of timing and preparation. Still, success remained elusive. Patrols were relentless and the dangers were many. Dogs trained to track human scent roamed the countryside, and bounty hunters made a living from capturing fugitives. Wallace was caught again and again, each time subjected to harsher punishment. But each time the desire for freedom grew stronger, not weaker. The 1860s brought seismic changes to the world around him. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 led to the secession of southern states and the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861. The war began as a conflict over union and sovereignty, but it quickly became inseparable from the question of slavery. For enslaved people like Wallace, the war was a beacon of hope, a sign that the system that had bound them for centuries was beginning to crack. The chaos of war created new opportunities for escape. Slave patrols were stretched thin, and the movements of armies disrupted established order. Perhaps most significantly, the advancing Union Army became a symbol of liberation. News spread rapidly through the enslaved population that those who reached Union lines could find protection. These stories were often fragmentary and confused, but they were enough to inspire new attempts. For Wallace, the war was both a risk and a chance. Confederate authorities increased their use of enslaved labor for military purposes, digging trenches, transporting supplies, and building fortifications. Conditions grew harsher and surveillance intensified, but amidst the increased oppression, cracks in the system widened. Wallace knew that if he was ever going to succeed, this was the moment. He began preparing meticulously. He studied the stars at night, learning how to navigate by them. He listened closely to the conversations of whites, piecing together information about troop movements and geography. He spoke cautiously with trusted people, gathering stories and advice. Every detail mattered. This time he would not rely on luck. This time he would have a plan. Wallace also understood that success meant more than reaching a distant line. It meant survival. Runaways who failed often faced death, and even those who succeeded sometimes perished from starvation, exposure, or illness before they found safety. The journey to Union lines could stretch hundreds of miles, across rivers, swamps, and hostile territory. It would test every ounce of his endurance, courage, and intelligence. Yet despite the dangers, Wallace was undeterred. The brutality of his existence had convinced him that life in bondage was no life at all. Freedom, no matter how distant or dangerous, was worth any cost. He would rather die a free man than live another day as property. As the Civil War dragged on, whispers of freedom turned into tangible possibilities. Word reached even the most isolated plantations that President Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, declaring enslaved people in Confederate states free. Although this did not instantly grant liberty to men and women in bondage, it shifted the very foundation of the conflict. Now, the Union Army was not just fighting to preserve the nation, it was fighting to destroy the institution that had enslaved Wallace and millions like him. This new reality transformed the minds and hearts of many enslaved people. It emboldened them to take risks they might have once deemed suicidal. Wallace was among them. Every rumor of a plantation abandoned by its owner, every story of fugitives finding refuge in Union camps, was like fuel poured onto a fire that had burned in his soul since childhood. Freedom was no longer a distant dream whispered about under moonlight. It was a goal that could be reached with courage, cunning, and determination. By 1863, Wallace was a young man, and with each passing month his knowledge of the land and his surroundings deepened. He knew which rivers could be crossed and which were too dangerous. He knew the patrols' patterns and how they shifted during times of unrest. He understood that fleeing would require him to think not just like a runaway slave, but like a soldier, anticipating obstacles, planning for contingencies, and adapting quickly to unexpected dangers. Despite the odds, he continued to plan and attempt escapes. Some were thwarted almost immediately, betrayed by informants or intercepted by patrols. Others lasted days, with Wallace traveling by night and hiding by day, surviving on whatever food he could scavenge or steal. Each failed attempt was brutal. Captured fugitives were often subjected to public beatings to deter others from trying. Wallace bore the scars of this punishment, physical reminders of his defiance, but they did not weaken his resolve. If anything, they hardened it. His persistence was not unique among the enslaved, but it was remarkable. Many who were captured after repeated attempts succumbed to despair, resigning themselves to their fates. Wallace, however, refused to surrender. Each failure taught him something new: how to evade dogs, how to conceal his scent, how to follow the North Star, how to judge distance by the terrain. He was becoming not just a fugitive, but a strategist, a man preparing for a final, decisive bid for his freedom. The world around him was also changing. Confederate resources were stretched thin, and many white men had left their homes to join the army, leaving plantations under the control of overseers and older men. Patrols were less frequent and communication was slower. The once iron grip of the slaveholding system was loosening, and with it came new vulnerabilities that people like Wallace could exploit. In one particularly significant attempt, Wallace managed to escape and stay hidden for several weeks, an extraordinary feat given the relentless efforts to recapture fugitives. During this time, he witnessed the world beyond the plantation. He saw free black men working and living in towns. He overheard conversations about the war, about Union victories, about emancipation and the possible future of a post-slavery America. These glimpses of a different reality strengthened his resolve further. They confirmed what he had always suspected. Slavery was not destiny. It was a system, cruel, violent, and powerful, but it was a system that could be defied and defeated. Still, every attempt ended in recapture, and each punishment was harsher than the last. Wallace's enslavers were determined to break him. They increased surveillance, restricted his movements, and kept him under closer watch. Yet none of it succeeded. No amount of violence could extinguish his determination. He had tasted the edges of freedom and knew there was no going back. By late 1863 and into 1864, the momentum of the war had shifted decisively toward the Union. Union forces were pressing deeper into the South, and thousands of enslaved people were fleeing plantations to join them. Entire families risked their lives on perilous journeys, sometimes guided by the clandestine networks of the Underground Railroad, sometimes relying solely on their courage and instinct. Wallace was determined to be one of them. He began preparing for what he knew would be his most ambitious and dangerous escape yet. He carefully observed the routines of those who guarded him. He mapped out, in his mind, the safest routes, those that offered cover, access to water, and the least likelihood of encountering patrols. He gathered what little supplies he could, scraps of food, a piece of cloth, anything that might help him survive the journey. He studied the night sky obsessively, committing to memory the position of the North Star and how it shifted as the seasons changed. What distinguished this plan from his earlier attempts was not just the depth of his preparation, but the clarity of his purpose. This was not a desperate bid for freedom. It was a calculated mission. Wallace knew the risks better than anyone. Capture could mean mutilation, permanent disability, or death, but he also knew that remaining where he was meant a lifetime of servitude, degradation, and unending suffering. The choice was clear. As the winter of 1864 approached, the atmosphere in the South grew tense. Union armies were advancing on multiple fronts, and the Confederate cause was beginning to crumble. Plantation owners grew more paranoid, some fleeing their estates in anticipation of invasion. The old order was collapsing, and with it the chains that had bound millions. For Wallace, this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. Everything he had endured, every beating, every failed escape, every scar, had prepared him for this moment. Wallace Turnage's final escape attempt would be unlike any that had come before. It would test the limits of his strength, his intelligence, and his willpower. It would take him through swamps and forests, across rivers and hostile territory, always under the threat of capture or death. But it would also carry him towards something he had never known, the possibility of a life lived on his own terms. And as he prepared to take his first steps toward freedom, he carried with him not just the weight of his own dreams, but the hopes of countless others who had been denied the most basic right of all, the right to be free. The night Wallace Turnage had dreamed of for years finally arrived. The skies were dark and heavy, with clouds offering precious cover from watchful eyes. The plantation was quieter than usual, the overseers confident in their control and unaware that their most determined captive had spent weeks planning his final bid for freedom. Wallace's heart pounded as he slipped into the night, his body tense but his mind clear. There was no turning back now. Every step he took was a step toward the unknown, toward either liberation or death. He carried almost nothing with him. a small piece of cloth tied around his waist containing scraps of food, and the memory of every failed attempt he had endured. But what he lacked in supplies he made up for in experience. Years of punishment and failure had taught him how to move silently, how to stay hidden, and how to read the land. This was no impulsive flight. This was a calculated mission, one that he had prepared for down to the smallest detail. The first hours were the most dangerous. Patrols often scoured the surrounding area, particularly near roads and rivers, the most obvious routes of escape. Wallace moved instead through dense forest, wading through brush and crawling beneath low-hanging branches. He kept close to the ground, his ears straining for the sound of dogs or human voices. Every rustle of leaves set his heart racing, but he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that to stop was to surrender. For days he traveled mostly by night, using the North Star as his guide and resting briefly during the day in hidden hollows or thick undergrowth. Hunger gnawed at him constantly. The small amount of food he had taken ran out quickly, forcing him to forage for berries or dig for roots. Thirst was an even greater danger. Streams were often patrolled or poisoned with disease, so Wallace had to drink sparingly and cautiously, always on the move. There were moments when fear nearly overwhelmed him. Once he heard the distant barking of hounds, a sound that sent a chill down his spine. Slave catchers often released dogs to track runaways, and the animals could follow a scent for miles. Wallace veered from his planned route, wading into a river to mask his trail before doubling back through a swamp. The terrain was treacherous and the mud clung to his legs, slowing him down, but it worked. The barking faded into the distance, leaving him breathless but alive. On another night, he narrowly avoided capture when he stumbled upon a group of armed men patrolling a road. He lay motionless in a ditch for hours, barely daring to breathe, as the men's lanterns bobbed past. Only when their footsteps disappeared did he rise and continue forward. Each brush with danger was a reminder of the stakes. A single mistake, a single misstep, and everything he had fought for would vanish. The journey was as much a mental trial as a physical one. Loneliness weighed heavily on Wallace. He had no companions, no one to share the burden of fear or the fleeting moments of hope. Yet even in solitude, he found strength in the memory of those he had left behind: his mother, the countless enslaved children he had known, the men and women whose lives were defined by toil and suffering. He was not running only for himself. He was running for all of them. Days turned into weeks. Wallace's clothes were torn and soaked from rain, his body weakened by hunger and exhaustion. Yet the thought of freedom sustained him. He imagined what it might feel like to wake up without the threat of a whip, to speak without fear of punishment, to walk without chains. These visions, once abstract and distant, now felt close enough to touch. At one point, Wallace came across a small group of fugitives traveling north. They were cautious at first, suspicious of a stranger appearing from the woods. But once reassured that he was one of them, they shared food and water and exchanged information. They spoke of Union forces advancing nearby and of safe routes through the woods. Their company was brief. They had different destinations. But the encounter renewed Wallace's resolve. He was not alone. Others were risking everything for the same dream. The closer he drew to Union lines, the more dangerous the journey became. Confederate soldiers patrolled heavily near the front, and the land itself was scarred by war. Abandoned farms, burned-out fields, and the occasional skirmish in the distance. Wallace often had to detour for miles to avoid roads or towns, adding days to his journey. At times he moved only a few miles in a night, every step deliberate and calculated. Yet with each passing day, signs of Union presence grew stronger. He found discarded blue uniforms and heard distant gunfire that told him the front was near. Hope surged within him, a cautious, fragile hope that this time, unlike the others, he might actually succeed. Then one night he saw it, the faint glow of campfires flickering in the distance. At first he thought it was a trap. Patrols sometimes lit fires to lure fugitives into the open. But as he crept closer, he heard unfamiliar accents, saw the silhouettes of men in Union uniforms, and realized with a start that he had reached the edge of freedom. Wallace paused at the edge of the clearing, his heart hammering in his chest. For a moment, fear held him still. What if he was mistaken? What if these men were Confederate soldiers disguised in Union blue? What if they captured him and dragged him back into bondage? But then he remembered everything he had endured to get here. Every lash, every scar, every failed attempt. He had come too far to turn back now. With trembling legs and a pounding heart, Wallace stepped into the open and called out. At first there was only silence. Then shouts rang through the night and armed men approached with lanterns raised. Wallace raised his hands and pleaded, identifying himself as a fugitive seeking freedom. The soldiers surrounded him, their faces a mix of suspicion and surprise. But then one of them stepped forward, lowered his weapon, and offered Wallace a drink of water. He was safe. The days that followed were a blur. Exhausted and weak, Wallace was brought into the Union camp where he was fed and examined. Union soldiers had encountered many runaways by that point in the war, and they understood the importance of the moment. They offered him not just food and rest, but something far more valuable, the recognition of his humanity. No one barked orders at him. No one raised a whip. No one called him property. In the camp, Wallace met others who had escaped. Men and women who, like him, had risked everything for freedom. Some had fled from plantations hundreds of miles away. Others had escaped from towns, farms, or even Confederate military labor camps. Each had a story marked by suffering and courage, and in their shared experience they found strength. Life in the Union camp was not without challenges. Many fugitives were put to work performing tasks for the army, digging trenches, hauling supplies, cooking meals. But for Wallace, even hard labor was transformed by the knowledge that it was done by choice, not by force. He was no longer a slave. He was a man working for himself, shaping his own destiny. In time, Wallace left the military camp and made his way north. The journey was long, but he was no longer running. He was traveling with purpose. He eventually settled in the north, where he took whatever work he could find. At various times, he worked as a waiter, a janitor, a glassblower, and a watchman. These were humble jobs, but they offered something far greater than money: independence. Yet even in freedom, the scars of slavery did not fade easily. Wallace carried the trauma of his past with him, the memories of beatings, the faces of those who had been left behind, the knowledge of how many had not survived the journey he had made. But he also carried something else: pride. He had defied the system that had sought to crush him. He had endured, resisted, and ultimately triumphed. As the years passed, Wallace's life remained modest. He never became wealthy or famous, but he built a life on his own terms, a life that would have been unimaginable to the boy born into chains in North Carolina decades earlier. He married, raised children, and lived out his days as a free man, a quiet, profound victory over the forces that had tried to deny him everything. Long after his death in 1916, Wallace Turnage's story might have been lost to history, buried like so many others beneath the weight of time, but his handwritten memoir, the account of his life in bondage, his repeated escape attempts, and his ultimate journey to freedom, survived. Passed down through generations, it was eventually discovered and published more than a century after his birth, giving the world a rare and deeply personal glimpse into the life of a man who refused to surrender.